You're here because you want this, and the moments only few get to actually live out. You play hard, you grind, you put in the hours, but is it ever really enough? The wins are small, the losses hit harder, and no matter how much you try, you're just not consistent. There's too much noise out there. The best strategy, the newest secrets, and not enough focused knowledge to actually grow your game. That's why we built a library of focused and dedicated lessons you need to know from the high-stakes pros you love. Common spots, final table analysis, and interactive live webinars, all from Nick Petrangelo, Ike Haxton, Daniel Dvoris, and more. If you're ready to gain the edge you've been looking for, sign up today at gtolab.com and stay ahead of the curve.
I think what really bothers me about this type of strategy is that it hinders the growth of the player so much. I find myself working with players like this and then having to undo the problems that caused.
Tied for the largest part of the day. Kevin has won both of those, 57-6.
What are some of the worst strategy ideas or biggest misconceptions floating around poker today?
There's some very basic strategies.
How do you try to make sense of what is instinct and what is your bias?
I needed to learn more about the people I was coaching and speak less about what I knew. I think it can make a player a better coach when they let go of the idea that they're trying to transform their students into a version of themselves.
Unless you are just the most money-hungry person in the world, it's going to be really difficult to get good at this game unless you find a way to like the work. What do you think, in general, you're seeing some of the bigger mistakes and hurdles that players of that level need to overcome to get to that goal? Kevin Rabichow, welcome to the GTO Lab podcast.
Thanks, John. Nice to be here.
Yeah. My introduction to you was not as Kevin Rabichow. It was Bearwire, a guy who makes some degree of training content at a time where I was very averse to any sort of training, any content. I don't think the word range was in my lexicon. I was as old school as it gets. And we played each other in some sort of W Coop, heads up. I don't know if it was the 10K, 5K, 25K, but we had an early round matchup. And you were doing at least part of a training video you made, must have been on YouTube, must have been publicly available. Do you remember this at all?
I have some memory of it, yes. So I can't remember if I was working for Run It Once yet, or if this is way back when I was working for headsupsitandgo.com or husng.com. But I definitely remember the single table video recording some sort of analysis. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't remember all that much. Someone shows it to me. I have no patience for this sort of thing at that time. And you're giving some analysis. You've got tens, and I 4-bet you. And you're giving all this complex analysis of what my range might look like, how you're comprising your range and everything. I'm just like, fuck this. Like, what is this guy talking about? That has nothing to do with what I'm doing. And then finally you get to it. I think my hand shows down and I have some nonsense like Jack 8 offsuit. I remember you had tens, if I remember correctly. And you also you casually mentioned, but it could also be the kind of thing where he just wants to 4-bet the first 3-bet. And I go, oh shit, this guy knows what's up. That's exactly what I was doing. I was just 100% going to 4-bet whatever the first time you 3-bet me. And I was like, people might be in my head. I might need to start getting better.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, that was the golden age of Heads Up was when there was that, like, there's a little bit of strategy going on, but there's a little bit of, I don't know, it's not really gamesmanship. What is it? It's game flow analysis, right? Like I remember having so many strategy conversations with my peers at the time, guys who I lived in like a poker house with in Toronto. And so much of the analysis was like that, right? So much of the analysis was like, what do you think the likelihood is that the first 4-bet is a bluff? What do you think the likelihood is that, the first limp is strong, or whatever, things like this, right? That was all we talked about.
Huge deal. Yeah. And like, how does that skew the math? It made it very difficult if you were an old school player to kind of want to adopt some of the, a more range-based look, is when you did encounter someone like me who was like, no, I was just going to 4-bet your first 3-bet. Like, how do you fit that into your strategy? It's not to say that, playing GTO is not going to crush someone with my approach, but how to optimize against that is really tough to like figure out, and to want to kind of really go down the theory road.
Yeah. I love stuff like that, and maybe it's because, like you, I have that heads up background. But I think
Mhm.
the times I run into it now is like when I'm coaching, let's say, an online grinder who's playing live and they don't play that much live poker, and they'll run into situations where they're playing against someone who I'm sure is thinking the way that you're describing. They're just, they're playing the button the way they know how, which is to 3-bet a lot, or they see you raising over a weak player's limp and they think that your range is half the deck when it's actually just a standard range. So that they don't see the game the way that some of these, older school minds see the game. And I need to kind of teach them to keep some weight in their analysis to the possibility of that, right? Not necessarily like guess, oh yeah, for sure they're light because of this game flow thing, but like don't ignore that possibility. You've maybe seen it 3 times in a row that they've done this from the button exclusively when that particular player's in the hand. Like, you should be paying attention to that kind of stuff, right? But not completely throwing all of your weight on that, or not ignoring theory and things of that nature. It's fun to combine those things.
Yeah, that's the key word, is weight, and it seems so difficult because this, psychological element, if we'll just put it all under the umbrella of psychology and the rocks, paper, scissors aspect of the game, knowing how to weight it is so difficult. It just doesn't really fall into these nice, tidy boxes of, well, 15% of the time he's just going to do this because of, it seems so difficult for a lot of the new school players, or not even just new school players. There are just some people who like to come at the game purely analytical, and it doesn't really fit neat and tidy into those boxes. Do you have any tricks for kind of like selling people on taking stock of these things without letting it completely override their process and just like throw GTO out the window?
I mean, it's a tricky question, because everyone I work with, or like everyone I talk to about poker, has their own like natural bias towards what like is on the front of their mind all the time, right? I know I've worked with some students who, and this is why I think it's important to actually like talk through thought process with other people, or talk through like hand analysis with other people, because they can catch this easier than you can catch it yourself. But some of these students will talk to me about their reasoning through a hand, and at no point will they mention any of those intangibles, right? And if at no point they're mentioning those intangibles, and I've been working with them for a while, it's like, look, you just gotta, like, I'll only talk to them about that stuff. I'll say, like, you got to pay more attention to this. You have to insert this. And I know that no matter how much I talk about it, it's not going to overwhelm their process, because they're so obsessed with theory.
Yeah.
And similarly, you run into these people who are anti-solver, or they're just like averse to using solvers. Maybe this was you, back when I recorded that video. And like again, it's just the other side. Like, I just need to, I'm not going to engage with that person too much on what they need to do better with live information. I'm going to constantly remind them where they're breaking away from theory too hard, and just like keep inserting those ideas so that they move a little bit further in that direction. But like, I don't know how to dial it in perfectly. I guess the best player in the world would just be aware of everything all the time, and use their intuition and their kind of game sense to grab the right thing in the moment.
So I'm sure you've had a similar experience being a coach for so long. It used to be that second camp that I would get so many of these guys who were the Jonathan Jaffe of 2010 kind of approach. And like, I have a friend and longtime student who he will not tell me a hand history without telling me about his last 3 VPIPs. He's like, well, I'd opened 2 out of the last 5 hands, and this guy had 3 bet. He knows a whole history of the table.
Yeah.
And I'm like, dude, I don't think any of this applies. Like, we're talking about just 2 good regs and a table full of regs. Like, really,
Yeah.
I don't know that this matters. And that type of player and that type of student, for me anyway, is less and less frequent. And it's more, and I think they're really easy to coach, in the sense that, like, sometimes it can be comical because they're too dismissive of solver, knowledge. But still, you just say, like, dude, look at the top 100 players in the world, look at where they're getting their information, look, it's just impossible to get good without memorizing a few things, etc. But the opposite tends to be pretty difficult when you've got, someone who has really only come at this analytically through a solver lens, and they see all these really bad players talking voodoo and white magic and just nonsense, about like, well, I mean, he already showed a bluff, so he wouldn't, he wouldn't bluff again in the next blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
or, oh, he just showed a bluff, so I know he's going to bluff more. Those guys, it's really tough to sell them on, no, there is some validity here. You're hearing 90% gobbledygook bullshit, but also, you need to tune into these frequencies because you will find some really, really helpful information. That I find to be a much more difficult sales pitch these days.
Yeah. And something I find helps connect, I think, with that player, the person who's obsessed with solvers and doesn't really pay attention to game flow and doesn't really take any of the psychology seriously, I guess, is to catch them when they do it themselves. So like to catch them when they miss a bluff because they just got caught bluffing, or to catch them when they, get greedy for value because they just bluffed it off big the previous hand. And it's like, you see what, like, do you not realize what you did here? Like, you did the thing that I'm trying to get you to see in other people. Like, you did the thing that all humans
That's
do.
a great point.
Because it's just buried in their psyche. Like, there's no way to. There are people who really excel at overcoming these things and like play the level 2 game where they'll bluff you 6 times in a row and be proud of it. But 95% of the population, including top pros, doesn't really have that, right? Like they're just regular people who feel averse to bluffing multiple times in a row because for whatever reason they think it won't work. And sometimes I have to teach people like, hey, like sometimes it can be even more intimidating to bluff after you've just shown down a bluff, right? Like a level-headed, rational thinker will see you on the other side and just assume you have it this time. And like it's hard to get into that side of the game until you open the possibility to them, like, oh, I fall victim to the same psychological biases, right? Like I'm human too.
And it's really these biases. It's just how far do you take them? So if making a live read, or let's say a timing tell read, or a read based on, hey, this guy had got caught bluffing last orbit, I think he's less likely to run a big bluff on the river here. Putting some stock in them, but not getting to this kind of absolute level, this point where you're just like, I'm 95% about this. And I think this is where I wonder if you've experienced this. One of the great hidden benefits of being a coach is hearing all these varied opinions, and you hear people tell the exact same story with 2 different results. They say, this guy had 3-bet me, my last 2 opens cut off first button, and now he 3-bets me a third time. And one person just says he has to have it, and another person just like, the guy's an animal, of course I have to 4-bet light or something. The exact same story in 2 very different results, and you see these these splits among different students. You try to grab a narrative out of it. This type of person thinks like that, and that type of person like that. But there's a lot of noise.
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's a good reminder that not everything, like it's like you were saying before, like not every piece of information has to be part of a story that determines what we do in the hand. But there are certain people, I think, who learn the game. I almost think of this as the tried and true game plan of Phil Hellmuth, or at least the way that he describes it. If you hear him talk about strategy and you hear him talk about like the types of plays that he was setting up, it's all this stuff. It's I was aware of the fact that I folded for 2 hours, so I did something insane, and I assumed that would work because I don't know. I guess before people saw big samples of hands, like they were 100% tricked by psychological stuff, right? Like they were 100% immersed in the idea that whatever you did for the last 2 hours was you. Like that's you as a poker player, and they didn't know the bigger picture. But now we're, like you said, we're so far past that. People have kind of systematic strategies in place that determine what they do, and a lot of the stuff that you see is just card distribution. So that's the online player mindset. I think it's why online players became so much more successful on average. But they can't just pretend that's the only way.
All right, let me take you to the coach's corner. I've got a bunch of my angle on this podcast is we've got potentially the best poker coach in the world. So I want to ask you about coaching. A lot of coaching questions. Let's see. We're starting off with, what takes some time for great players to become great coaches? What do you think exists in that delta between being great at this game and being great at teaching it?
So I think a big, I'll give a couple probably points, but the big turning point for me in taking my coaching more seriously was realizing that I needed to learn more about the people I was coaching and speak less about what I knew. Like it's so natural when you first get into coaching and you're really experienced in something, you're like an expert in that field, to just talk your expertise, just to like show off all the things you know.
Mhm.
And not necessarily stop to consider if the way you're saying it or the specific things you're saying are actually helpful to the person who's listening and the person who's like paying for your time. So really, like, the path towards becoming a better coach in my mind is understanding your students' needs better, understanding their learning style, understanding teaching styles, like all that kind of educational training, I suppose, that none of us really would ever have just from being poker players. But there's also like this kind of commonly talked about challenge, I guess, that some super great players just have like natural instinct or talent that they can't convey.
Mhm.
That's like a very commonly spoken about one that captured my attention for so long. I was obsessed with this idea that I would need to find the right way to translate expertise, like from the coach to the student in some way. And over time, I've just kind of taken my hands off the wheel with that. I've decided, like, no, I don't think there's just certain stuff that can't be translated via words, and it needs to be translated via experience. And for that reason, there's like, I'll sometimes call that stuff out. But it also has helped. I think it can make a player a better coach when they let go of the idea that they're trying to transform their students into like, a version of themselves, and accept that they're just trying to take them on the path of becoming the best version of themselves. So that's like, to me, that's another big one, is you don't need to translate your expertise in that sense, right? Like maybe the way for a great player to make their student better has nothing to do with teaching them how to like make the sick hero call that you made in that one big spot, right?
Sure.
Like maybe that's just a thing that you do that they won't do, and that's fine.
How blunt are you with students whose goals are too lofty, or the timeline with which they, want to achieve them is just not really feasible? How kind of quick are you to be like, look, the game is beautiful and I hope you continue this journey, but you got no chance of making it to where you're talking about in 6 months, and you just happen to have run really good the 2 months prior to coming to me. You might be in for some pain, even though you're going to get better.
Yeah. I guess I would say I'm pretty blunt, although, I consider myself kind as a coach. Like I think I try to support whatever my student is interested in doing, but also just the very nature of the way that I coach, I'm kind of a systems guy. Like I approach coaching with a lot of structure. So anytime I get a student, I'm asking them exactly what you're saying. Like I'm asking them about where they are right now, what their skill set is, where they're trying to get to. And sometimes I'll just be like, honestly, I don't even think we should be working together. Like it just doesn't make sense. Like you're here, and like I love that you're ambitious, but you got to start with some more basic material because you're just not there yet.
Mm-hmm.
So I will have to deliver. Like I've just made a decision as a coach that's my method. Like the structure has to be in place for it to make sense for us to work together. And as a result, I kind of have to be blunt about those things sometimes.
What are some of the worst strategy ideas or biggest misconceptions floating around poker today? You can pick any stake, cash game, tournament, heads up. Just kind of curious what you think is kind of wrong in the poker meta that is reaching a lot of people.
Let me think about this.
Yeah, take your time.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that comes to mind, it's a little bit online specific, so I don't know if it's well, it definitely overlaps into live, but something that I come across a lot, because of how common it is for players to be part of stables, or like big staking groups or whatever, is that I come across a lot of these like formulaic strategies that people are trying to use. They want like cookie cutter, this is where people fold too much type strategies. And I take a lot, I wouldn't say I take total issue with it, because there is kind of a validity to the idea that there's just spots that you can come across that you don't have to think so hard about your strategy, and you should probably just bluff, or you should probably just call, or whatever. And I do teach methods that borrow from that idea, but I really do. I think it's unfortunate, I guess, let's say, that there's so much strategy out there now that's just like robotic. And even in live poker, but real people executing real strategies, but doing no poker thought, like doing no real decision making analysis, just kind of going out and expecting, like, oh, like if you ask them, if you talk to them about the hand, like, why did you bet half pot on the river? And it's like, well, because it's the most efficient bet size. It's like, what do you mean most efficient? It's like, oh, it just makes the most money when they fold too much.
My stable showed me the data, and therefore I should be doing this.
Yeah, and it's everywhere. Like it's one of those things that I need to be aware of a little bit as a coach, because I need to prepare some of my students to play against it. I need to put a little bit of that into their thought process. But it really bothers me when people's strategy ideas just boil down to like, oh, I was told by some outside source that every time you check bet, they fold. And it's like, all right, I mean, I guess the discussion's over, right? Like I guess you don't have to, it's a good excuse to not pay attention, to not make real decisions in game, to not adjust your play in any way ever. Like it's really uninteresting to me. And I like the game for all of its elements.
It's level one. It's basic. It reminds me, the one that comes to mind for me a lot is, and again, there's validity to this, but it's still very incomplete, and it caps you as a player if you say, hey, people in my games overfold to check raise when they go B33, and you're just printing when you go 4 big blinds over 1.5. Look, here's the proven win rate. We've got all this data on it. Sure, that's fine. But poker doesn't end there. It's not in a vacuum, and it's much more difficult to say, when they did float you, what was turn like? You're now check raising all these hands that you have no fucking idea how to play on the turn. And your stats are going to catch up, and some of these people are going to be pretty adept. Maybe 70% of the population doesn't even pick up on this. Maybe you're playing against people who don't have HUDs, but then that 30% or whatever who are aware of this, they're crushing you, or they're going to crush you in 3 months unless you make this massive evolution. I think if you a corollary to real world would be, hey, people like being complimented. When you compliment people, you soften them and they are nicer towards you and you get all these good things. Great. But if you go around just keep dropping stock compliments at everyone, other people are going to observe you and be like, his compliments are worth shit. This guy is clearly just doing this for X reason, and there's so many of those things. I think socially, you see it in like the dating world, all these things that they're great if you're maybe trying to get a second date, or maybe even if you're trying to get laid at a bar or something like that. But if you're trying to get this kind of lasting, strong relationship, and if you're trying to build this really good poker game that can take you to the high stakes, or even be one of the better mid-stakes players, it's not going to live in this like, what's the best bet size on the turn for bluffs? Like, it's nice, it's fun for a minute, but it really caps you.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. Like, and I guess you can relate. Like, I think what really bothers me about this type of strategy is that it hinders the growth of the player so much, because I find myself working with players like this and then having to undo the problems that caused, because now they just automate their way through hands, and then they get to points in the hands where they don't have a formula, and then they just try to answer it from there. And it's like, well, we've got to go all the way back to the very beginning, right? Like we've got to teach you how to think through a poker hand in a adaptive way, in a creative way, or whatever. And it would have been easier to do if they were never taught all that stuff.
Yeah, undoing it is really tough because tricks are so appealing. Like the videos, I mean, we joke about it, but like how to play pocket jacks perfectly, how to, never fuck up ace king again, like whatever. Just these ridiculous things where you're like, I'm a pretty good player, but kind of curious what they have to say about this, because I've played jacks not great before. let me see what's going on there. And it's like, I mean, you still have people today who are just like, hey, I want to know how to deal with people. I'll read how to make friends and influence people. Carnegie seemed like a really smart guy. And it's like, great. now you're level one across everything and you're this flattened human person. Like it's just really, really difficult to evolve past that when you learn on the trick level on everything. I think it takes a long time to most people I just think don't ever evolve out of that, which takes me to kind of the snake oil part of this coaching space. You and I are both a part of this, and I'm sure you feel some, I would imagine, I'm throwing your feelings out there. I'll say, I feel some frustration. I don't know. There's a better word for this, about knowing that so many people in this space are robbers is taking it too far, but they're scammy. They're not even great poker players sometimes, or even some of them are quite good poker players, but they're selling people on exactly the simple strategies we talked about, which will cap them really early on because it's super appealing and that's what people want. It kind of, one of the big things is like the customer's not always right, is how I feel about the poker coaching space. But if you're trying to make the most money, following that old adage, that they are always right is probably the best move. How do you navigate this? How do you feel, being such a long-time coach?
Yeah, it can be frustrating. I agree. I guess on one hand, like I try not to judge the intent of another coach or the, I don't want to attribute malice to these other coaches who are maybe just running a business that doesn't coincide with the way I like to run my business. It doesn't align with my values or whatever. Because I for example, like I have had plenty of people come to me asking if they should join a particular CFP or a particular stable. And I wouldn't say that I never think it's a good idea to be part of a CFP, but those businesses exist to be efficient at scale, right? Like those businesses operate in general on the business model that a small number of coaches can handle a huge number of students. And if all of them make on average a very modest amount of money, the coaches get rich, which is like not ideal for the players, right? I mean, that means the average player is getting probably low return on their investment, maybe negative return on their investment. But at the same time, those players might need the money. Like if they're getting a backing deal, they might need the money. So when I'm comparing those kinds of coaching businesses or whatever, I'll warn them about the structure, right? And if they're taught by a good coach, if they're taught by someone qualified, I think they can also just set those people up to be successful down the road, right? I mean, to some extent, I admire the coaches who can operate a successful stable or a successful CFP, because it's not easy. Like I tried to run a small one myself and quickly came to realize how hard it is to do small. Like it really is. It's a big business kind of model, and especially in today's games, I guess, with smaller edges and it being tougher to get big volume in online for these players. But like, I mean, those aren't the only places, I guess, where coaching can be questionable. But again, I just, I see other coaches who maybe teach in ways that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, or they teach concepts that I don't necessarily think is going to contribute to the growth of that player long term. But I mean, I'm sure this happens in every industry. Like I'm sure in my limited experience playing sports and coaching sports, like everyone has their own approach to teaching different things. There's very little oversight that says, unless you're part of a professional organization, like there's very little oversight telling coaches what information to deliver and when and how, unless they go seek out the training themselves.
Yep.
And in poker, there's even less oversight, right? I mean, there's no overarching body that's teaching coaches how to deliver information and laying out the fundamentals in some way that the whole community agrees upon, and then filtering that information down to new players. Like there's no structure like that. So it really is like, it's up to the customer, I suppose, to be discerning and to go into coaching with some skepticism and to recognize like, oh, not everyone knows everything. And maybe I'll get a little bit from this person, a little bit from them. And if any red flags pop up, I can always leave. I mean, that's what I would encourage students to embrace, because I mean, obviously I'm not going to agree with every coaching method and every individual stable and their techniques.
Yeah, I think as you're saying that, what's popping in my head is that poker is still a new space, relatively speaking, and poker coaching. I mean, 15 years ago, if you said, "Oh, I'm a poker coach," mostly people would be like, "You mean you're not very good at poker, but you want to make money at poker?" Where like the true professional coach. Coaching space is also relatively new. And I think in new ecosystems, you have that Wild West mentality where you're going to have some people who are just like, look, if someone's willing to pay, that makes it ethical. And you're going to have other people who, have a very different approach. And it takes a while to really distill things and kind of get you're being more charitable than me, but I would say some of the bad actors, to the point where they're not making so much money off of this, where it is profitable for them to be more deceptive or less looking out for their customers as they are for their bottom line. I think it takes a while to really filter that out.
Yeah.
Free market takes a while
definitely
to do its job.
Yeah.
All right, here's a tough hypothetical. Let's take a guy who is break even, $800 live ABI. His goal is to get to 5K buy-ins, being in the top 10 percentile of those fields. Live player. What do you think in general you're seeing some of the bigger mistakes and hurdles that players of that level need to overcome to get to that goal?
And I suppose in this hypothetical, I'm assuming that they've been a live player. That's their world. Like they know live tournaments and they made it to $800 ABI, and that's just kind of where they capped out.
Exactly. We're going to say maybe they've been playing for like 5 years, almost no online experience, pretty reluctant to play online. They kind of want to do this without incorporating online.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll admit my exposure to that exact profile is limited, but I have some ideas about what they might be struggling with. Because just in my limited experience with those fields, it's just sloppy technically, like the what I would call the fundamentals. So, good understanding of chip EV preflop, a good understanding of chip EV single raise pots, like very, very simple parts of the game for an online player would be probably lacking in these players.
Mm-hmm.
And if they kind of grew up in live, or they learn the game through live, I would expect that their game sense is reasonable, that like their reads are reasonable. I mean, I would obviously pay attention to this stuff, but I would think that it's not going to be that helpful for them anymore to keep doing one-off hand review with other players and keep getting opinions, because I assume that's probably how they've studied up to that point. But at the same time, there's not a lot of, well, I might be wrong about this. Maybe you're familiar with some, but I don't see a lot of training content that addresses those games. Like formal coaching that goes out to the masses that is targeted at that player. Other than maybe like the Solve for Why content, for example. I'm sure there's something from poker coaching, but like basically my instinct is that player lacks what I would call some technical fundamentals. They could probably just hop on a trainer or some sort of basic tool, not high level ICM theory, not high level final table strategy yet. Probably just like, let's make sure you're building stacks in tournaments where there's just a ton of free money, right? Mm-hmm. Like that's a level where you should be able to just be like kind of an excellent cash gamer approach and build up a bunch of advantageous bubble spots, advantageous final table spots where the rest of the decisions are not that hard. And only once they prove that they can get to that point would I start worrying about the finer details of like structural strategies and, final table details, the higher level stuff. That would be my first impression.
Gotcha. What about the guys who tend to kind of turn things up right before World Series or right before a poker trip, but overall they're not much in the way of studiers? What do you do for them? How do you kind of help these people stay motivated between trips so that each time that they, are a week before poker tournament, they're not just kind of like brushing up and getting back to where they were, but they're actually progressing?
Yeah, I've definitely coached some players, or I can imagine some players who spend most of the year, let's say, playing cash games or not necessarily playing full time, and then every time World Series rolls around, or every time like the Winter Series rolls around, they're ready to get geared up. They're like, oh, I've got a month until the big show. Like, how do I get ready? And for those players, it's tough because they're lacking that routine development that they could be getting through the year, especially in the tournament space if they're a cash game player.
Mhm.
So for a lot of those players, like, I can do what I can in a few weeks to help someone prep for a series, but at the end of the day, I think they should just be playing more tournaments throughout the year. They should be thinking about tournaments a little bit all year. But then when I think of someone who is mostly focused on tournaments, and it's just that they don't study until those big moments, I think that's actually like not a bad. This is you. It's honestly not a bad approach. So like I've been workshopping this coaching model, or like coaching products, let's say. I have a friend, Jared Alderman. He's a performance coach, and the two of us have worked together a little bit with private students. But like what we want to introduce is this, let's call it a full season, like you would have in a professional sport, where for 4 months, maybe 4 to 5 months straight, you're in season, you're just playing tournaments, you're making money, you're doing what, you're doing your job essentially. And then for like 6 to 8 weeks before, let's call it, the next season begins, you take an off season, right? Like you take a proper, doesn't have to be a full break, but I would say like at least a few weeks where you're taking time off, you're evaluating what needs to be worked on for the upcoming season, you're recovering, recharging, maybe this involves taking a vacation, maybe the vacation comes right before the off season. But the idea is like, a lot of poker players don't really give themselves the space to like analyze what they've been going through and then get ready for the next push. And in my mind, it'd be a perfect structure for a full year tournament player to like play for, what would the dates be? Play from like December series until April, or maybe like late March or something, and then take a short vacation, hop into an off-season program, evaluate what they need to be working on, do some real study for a few weeks, maybe play Sundays online or something, maybe go to like one tournament here and there to stay sharp.
Yeah.
And then like 1 week before the World Series begins, take another full break, like forget about poker, and then hop into the series, right? To me, that'd be like such a better, and then you could do it again in the second half of the year, right? So this is kind of our idea. Like if we get this program going twice a year, we would do it like pre-World Series and pre-Winter Series kind of thing, 6 to 8 weeks. And in my mind, it's kind of what I've already done, but only by necessity of blending coaching and live tournament poker. And I've found it successful to give those periods of preparation. But it's hard when you never really step out and evaluate what's going on in your game. You just kind of like float through poker, and it's like, oh, what's the next tournament? What's the next tournament? What's the next tournament? And then eventually it's like, oh crap, it's the World Series. I need to get ready. And then some students will even reach out to me and they'll be like, I want to get ready for World Series 2 months beforehand. Perfect. No problem. We can meet once a week. Maybe they'll buy 10 hours or they'll buy 5 hours. We'll meet once a week until the World Series. And then they show up for a week and it's like, oh, there's this thing going on at the lodge. Like, I'm going to go. I'm going to go play that. And then I'll be back for the next one. We'll take 1 week off. All right. No big deal. Seminole Hard Rock, they got their series going on at the end of the month. Let me finish that up and then we'll be back. Okay. Yeah, no problem. They do like one more session. It's like, yeah, I'm going to go play Gardens the week before the World Series. So yeah, it's been great. Like it's something, but like we could do a lot better if we were more deliberate about it.
That was me practicing golf. I would get to the club, I'd get there on the range, start hitting, look at the course behind me. No one's on the first tee, no one's on the second. Probably a good time to go play. I'm going to go play. And just kind of ran off every time. But yeah, to my ear, two really nice things jump out about the program that you laid out. One is how much poker does just blend one thing into another. And for many people, it's like years before they, take a month off and just take a full step back and get a little perspective. And I think, you can be astounded. I'm not that person. I've always taken lots of big breaks. And I think that it has benefited me in having perspective in terms of both, do I want to be playing the games I'm playing? Am I enjoying this? Comparing my hourly versus my enjoyment, and, just kind of taking a more holistic look at things, let alone, what it does in terms of realizing where your EV bleeds are, and, I was really hung up on these two hands, but they don't make any difference to my bottom line. And this is something I've been ignoring that I suck at. But then the second part is, I think a lot of my students would really like this off-season coaching program that you're mentioning, because there's this kind of motivation and structure seem to be very attached in the poker world, because we don't have this natural structure. It's not this linear progression of here's how you go from, an F grade poker player to an A grade. It's much less measurable, and the results cloud things in a big way, especially if you are a live tournament player, for example. You'll go your whole career without having a sample size that's particularly relevant. But so I think there's this craving for structure, and a lack of structure demotivates people. So having this, I'm going to go work with Kevin for a week right now, and there's going to be a group of other people who are motivated and working. I can see the appeal of that in a really big way, where so much of getting good at poker is just liking it. If you don't like the work, you're kind of fucked. Like, you're drawing dead to get good, unless you are, that type of person who, I'm supporting my family, I'm willing to just go through a lot of hell because this is what it takes to put food on the table. That's not too many people these days, at least in North America. I haven't found that as often. I think, you do see that in some other countries, and probably other coaching groups are much more aware of that person. But I know Nick Petrangelo told me maybe like 6-7 years ago, when I was pretty disenchanted with poker and not interested in getting better or engaging with solvers, that I had to learn to like it. If I didn't like it, it wasn't going to happen. And I try to tell students that, that, unless you are just the most money hungry person in the world, it's going to be really difficult to get good at this game unless you find a way to like the work.
Yeah. I'm starting to appreciate that more as a coach too, because like when I first, let's say, launched like my full-time coaching business, I had this kind of this ethos, I guess, that I taught by or lived by, that my goal was to make the student independent, right? Like, my goal was to deliver enough tools and resources, information, whatever, so that they could just be on their own and I didn't have to handhold. But I think what I overlooked with that mentality was that I wasn't providing the structure that allowed the student to like gain momentum and actually move their way through the work. So I was leaving it completely up to them to build their own structure, to find their own way to make that happen. And when I put together a course for Run It Once, like it helped a little bit in realizing like, oh, right, if you build a Discord and you tell people to show up to these seminars and you tell people that they're learning these things, like they'll just do it. They'll show up and they'll do the work. And now I'm more and more moving towards these like group coaching formats and seminar programs, things that have some structure built in, where it's like, yeah, I get it. Like, I'm still going to teach you the things that you need to learn independently, but I also understand that motivation doesn't always come from the inside. Like, motivation can be built by the coach or by the training site. And I think it's important.
There's something to be said about, even away from poker, just your kind of the relationship between age and structure. One of the best things about being a poker player when you're 24 is you just, define your own schedule, do whatever you want. And I think what you're talking about, if you had brought that to a bunch of 24-year-olds and been like, all right, be here at this, you get a bunch of this, like, I'm good, bro. Like, just tell me the knowledge. Don't tell me exactly, when I need to show up and all that. And now, you're mid-30s too, right?
Yeah, I'm 35.
35, yeah. And everyone I see in poker is like, give me more structure. Give me, I want to have a fully defined schedule. I want to be told do this and then do that. And it's, you really, you find that without structure, it doesn't actually feel like freedom. You just feel untethered and confused. And that's like not a very pleasant feeling for most people trying to advance in a career path.
Yeah. You just reminded me how much easier it's been the last few years actually to keep a calendar. Like when I coached even just 5 years ago, I would have people forget about my meetings all the time, just not show up. People would like we'd try to schedule. I would try to schedule them a week out, and they would be like, I got to get back to you like the day before. Like they just couldn't handle it. Like my students literally couldn't handle putting something on a calendar a week out. Like now I book consultations like 3 weeks in advance, and people actually show up on time. It's crazy. I didn't really reflect on that until just now.
Yeah. I kind of have like I rarely will set anything 2 weeks out or whatnot, but yeah, I have some students who really, that's just how they operate, and they've got their whole schedule, like 2 months in advance, and I'm just like committophobe. But the idea of figuring out what I'm doing next month, like I really don't want to lock down 4 p.m. on Saturday. I might want to play tennis. I don't know.
That's funny.
Can you talk about the importance of database reviews? This is something that I don't do with my students because I am incompetent with poker tools by and large, but I refer people out to others who do this. You talk about what a player gets from a database review.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak mostly to the online player because it's kind of difficult to do this in the live arena. And I used to only do database reviews as my first session with students. I thought it was kind of ridiculous to start anywhere else, because if you're an online player and you have you play full time, so you have a full time amount of hands in your database, I can learn pretty much everything about you in an hour. Like I can learn your whole, and sometimes people are like, I think people without experience in database review think I'm performing some kind of magic when I like tell them like, oh, you're probably someone. I look at their database for like 15 minutes and I'm like, oh, you're probably someone who like bets too much air on the flop, so you check back the turn and
you've been
arrive in the situation
on the button too, right? And you just know
yeah, like
button percentage.
I don't even use the most advanced tools that we have available for database review, but there's just like there's so much to learn about the person and what they're struggling with and what they could improve if you look at the data. And until someone does that sort of self-reflection or pays someone else to do that analysis for them, I think they have all these blind spots in their own game that are just going to go unchecked, right? So yeah, I mean, when I did that, like I just don't work with as many online players as I used to. So I don't, this isn't my core coaching product like it used to be, but this was by far the most effective method of coaching I was giving people. People would show up for 2 hours, do a database review, and never come back. I had one guy a friend of mine in Canada, book a database review with me, disappear for a while, then send me a graph of him winning like $150,000 or something, and be like, "Thanks, you like your 1 hour of coaching allowed me to retire," and now he doesn't even play poker anymore. Oh, and he like it's pretty much just I don't know. It's the equivalent of well, I don't know tennis well enough to say that coaches would do this, but if you started private tennis lessons and your coach just watched you hit for an hour, like presumably they could just tell you everything that's wrong with your game if you wanted them to, right? You don't need to go through the whole back and forth of explaining the problems that you're having.
Yeah.
And talking about the matches you played 6 months ago. You don't go to that coach and tell them stories, right? You go to that coach and you play tennis in front of them, and then they tell you what you could do better. And that's basically what a database review is. It's just revealing your whole poker game to the coach and letting them help you get better.
I like that analogy. What should consumers be on the lookout for when looking for coaching? What are some of the traps they could fall into, especially if they don't have a strong poker circle or are kind of new to the world?
I guess it depends where they're looking for their coaching in the first place, right? There's a lot of different ways you can come across a coach, and I'll maybe speak to the different ways that people have reached out to me. I made content with Run It Once for a long time. A lot of people just heard me speak about the game and then eventually connected with the way that I was teaching and then reached out to me and asked if I did coaching. And I think that's a very reasonable way to figure out if you think you're compatible with a coach is to get a free sample of their work, right? Or maybe not free sample, but to have some idea of what it is that they have to offer. And I guess that that leads me to the other method of finding a coach that is a little different is just going to their website or seeing an advertisement on Facebook or Instagram or whatever, and connecting with them based on their written description of what they can offer to you, right? And connecting with those coaches, well, you don't have as much to go off of. Like, people have found me that way, and I would hope that they would agree that I've delivered them value, but you can't necessarily understand what it is that you're going to get from that coach if you've never seen them play, seen them speak in, by recorded content or on live stream or whatever. And even if they've there's different types of stuff they could have done content wise that maybe give you more or less faith in their ability to be a coach. But at the end of the day, I think it goes back to what we spoke about earlier. Like, the good coaches are going to relate to their students. They're going to try to understand their students. They're going to be invested in the growth of them from, where they are to where they'd like to get. So I would be looking for that kind of language in their description of their coaching. I would be looking for that sort of approach in the way that they talk about the game if they've done training content. If you've just seen them play, I mean, if they're a great player, they probably have something to offer. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. But I think what I'd be worried about is someone who, like we spoke about, someone who claims that they just have solutions, they have answers. They come to you with a formula that says, you can make this much money in this much time, and it's like, is that maybe that's what I need right now, but is that going to align with my goals as a student? Like, that's what I would be asking myself if I was in that position. Like, yeah, if you desperately need to make money and you need to join a program to make money, I mean, like, maybe it is your best option. But if you can go kind of through the open marketplace and pick a coach, like find someone who's shown evidence that they're invested in success of their students.
Yeah, that last part, invested in the success of their students. There's a lot of people who I think the impression I get is not scammy at all, and they probably are even pretty good players and have the tools to coach well, but they're often not assertive enough, in the sense that the students are very often going to ask the wrong questions. They're going to want to spend so much time on, I had 14 big blinds in the hijack. Should I have shoved ace jack O or opened? And it's just like, I don't fucking care. It doesn't matter. We're not going to spend any more time on this. Like, this is ridiculous. And it takes, to me, like, you have to, very often the questions are just wrong. And if you just kind of keep answering the wrong questions, you're not doing anything wrong as a coach, but you're not making them better as a player. And it takes, like, one thing I would say to be on the lookout for is, like, are they ever rephrasing your questions and redirecting you and saying, like, no, this is not a good use of our time. We need to spend more time on this. This incredibly unique situation that you found yourself on the turn in this double board bomb pot, even though you don't play double board bomb pots, is a terrible use of my hourly right now. You are just getting crushed just so you can get some validation or answer about one spot that you played.
Yeah.
Like, I think there's a lot of placating people and what they want. And then it's not scammy, but it's just like, really? Like, this is just not particularly helpful. And I think it's truly investing in your students. You said something to me maybe like a year and a half ago. We were talking about coaching at Hard Rock, and you said that, at least at that time, you were kind of only taking 10-hour commitments and up for the initial. And I wasn't at the time. And like the next week changed to that, because you're just not incentivized to deliver properly if there's not a long-term commitment, which unfortunately opens the door for scammers, because, like, getting a long-term commitment when you don't know what you're doing is a great way to, make money if people weren't going to come back to you naturally. So I kind of don't like that attachment, but you need this investment in more than the person just being happy with their session today, to truly, coach well, I think.
Yeah. It's a good point. Like, the model they're going with does matter. Because I've definitely found that it's more, it used to be more common when I did hourly coaching that people would show up with that, like, list of questions, list of hands, list of whatever it is that they want to go through.
Mm-hmm.
And I would feel kind of obligated to, like, address all the things that they brought.
Yeah.
But that was just that wasn't necessarily like I would, yeah, if I went on and did that and just like kept up in the rain and kept doing that, like I don't think I'd be a very good coach. But it was an opportunity for me to realize that the model needed to be changed. So like I just set up a way for people to send me the stuff before the session started, right? Like that's a very simple change.
Mhm.
But anything that they're going to bring, just send it to me beforehand so that I can review it, so that I can determine what we're going to talk about, right? And in what order and for how long, right? Like I have visibility over that stuff rather than just like, what are we doing today? Like, and just kind of waiting for the questions to come through. And even I think even just that 10-hour commitment thing, which I am still doing for the most part, like it it brings a different type of student who has more than just a few lingering questions that they'd like to deal with. It
Mhm.
brings someone who's already decided I'm here to invest in the long term, and that makes it so much easier on the coach's side to say, okay, well that's great. Like that's what now I have a target for you. Now I have something that we're trying to bring you towards, and I'm going to do that extra stuff in between to make sure that we can get there together.
Yep. I'm with you. I think I'm very loose about letting my students text and email me stuff. And for me, what it does is it makes me feel very free for the session to be what I want to do. We're going to do what I think is right for you. Outside of the session, it's all going to be free. Text me, email me, understand that I'm not always going to get back to you right away. But this is where you scratch your itch. You played this hand, you want to know something. You're not trying to really get better theoretically. You might tell yourself you are, but you just want to know, did I play this hand well? And I'll just write back a response about what I would have done, But in the session, like that's when, I think the real work needs to take place. And I don't think, I think this is true of anything, is it's pretty rare that a person really knows what they need to work on themselves. That's what everyone else can see, or that's what the experts can see.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It's tempting. Like I do struggle with this because it's always tempting when someone says like, I have a concern about multi-way pots or whatever. It's like, I'm going to note this concern. I'm going to put it on our sheet. Right. But we're not going to talk about it right now. And we might, we'll get to it eventually. And knowing that commitment exists allows us to make that kind of judgment call for the student, which is really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
But without that, like, what else can you do? I mean, I could be direct and just say like, no, that's a waste of time. Like, let's do something else. But it also feels like you're being dismissive of what they care about, right? Like,
Sure.
you still want to acknowledge that, I think, as a coach, but you need to, you do know better at the end of the day, like where their time should be spent if you've taken the time to get to know them as a player.
I think this is, maybe there's another coach out there who approaches this a little bit differently. And trying to play devil's advocate, I would say you and I probably have a lot of privilege here in that our reputations are such that the people coming to us already trust us implicitly on this sort of thing. Whereas if you're not such a big name, you're charging a lower hourly, you're not as established, you kind of feel like, hey, this guy might fire me if I don't do what he wants. We kind of need to, address these things. I need him to be happy coming out of each session. And it kind of just spirals you into not being a particularly great coach, in my opinion. But yeah, I mean, that was just kind of occurring to me off the cuff. But I feel like I can see how difficult it must be for therapists, for psychologists to help people in their growth as a person and not get fired to telling them the things they don't want to hear.
Yeah. From what I know about therapy, it'd be even more challenging because so much of it is just like not fixing their problems. Like so much of that work is just about making space and being like, yeah, I hear you.
Yeah.
How does that make you feel? And then and then the session's over and it's like, I'm going to do nothing about that. Like, would you like to see me again next month?
Yeah.
That would be so stressful for me. I mean, it's like not horribly different from some of the things. Like I do kind of borrow ideas from that when it comes to like the performance side of coaching, but it's hard.
Yeah, somebody told me something at this most recent Triton. I can't remember who to attribute this to, but they were saying in the search for a therapist, if in the first 10 minutes they haven't said anything that made you think that you found insightful, just move on. We were talking about like basically how long to, and maybe this is similar for a poker coach, not nearly as important as, a therapist, but how long do you spend with someone before you move on to the next one? Because the search for the perfect fit, is really difficult. I mean, dating is probably a great example. Like, how many, dates do you continue with someone? And we were talking about it from a mathematical lens. Like, if you have X amount of time, that like you should never continue with any of the first 10 unless you're like sure that this is 95th percentile person. But after the first 50 or something, then you take anything that's better than 40 or 80% of what you've seen. I don't know. It was interesting.
This is a classic poker player conversation, to take a very normal emotional decision and turn it into like an optimization problem.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
On that topic, I was talking with Henrik Hecklin this morning, and he sent me a video, a YouTube video about cooperation and game theory. It was a prisoner's dilemma video, and about kind of how that influences cooperation across the board in life, which is a topic I'm really interested in. But we kind of sidebarred into how lucky we are as poker players to have been exposed to all of this, to this probabilistic approach to life that has now not only exposed to it, but at a time when it's really catching fire in the rest of the world. So maybe like if you were John von Neumann in whatever the 40s, he's a genius and he's very well respected, but he's not going to be very in touch with many people. Like, Moneyball wasn't out. There wasn't, like even the finance bros of 1940 are not really thinking in that direction, I don't think. And we kind of like the things that we got into in the last 15, 20 years are really reaching the world at large in a pretty big way now. But you still come across really intelligent people who don't really think probabilistically. And that, I don't know. I always find that really fascinating, where like it still floors me, but then it's so cool to see the gears turn if they're, a pretty sharp person, and how quickly they can kind of remold their thinking. I don't know the question.
Well, I mean, I appreciate the same dynamic. Like I have found when I got into poker, which I guess you were probably around the same time, it was, and maybe this was like just being a younger person, but it was almost like something you didn't really talk about with people outside of poker, because there was some stigma about gambling, or there was all this like extra explanation that you had to do, and it didn't feel worth it to engage in conversation. And now I find like any random person that I encounter in my life is going to have a rewarding conversation in some way, because like it has touched their life. Like maybe it's just the gambling side of things, because online gambling or gambling in general is a lot bigger of an industry lately. But I think just so many more people are in touch with these types of problems. And it can spark interesting conversation. But I think that point you made about people not thinking probabilistically, I mean, that must just be because of how like hardwired we are to not think probabilistically, right? Like it is actually just a difficult reframe for a human, unless they've been formally brought through the process of, zooming out from whatever's happening in front of them and thinking long term. The long run is not something that comes naturally to a person's brain.
If you watch a newscast, they're not speaking in probabilistic terms. There's the occasional qualifier and adjective, but they're not throwing percentages out at you. And if you scan headlines, they're meant to grab your attention. So they're in way too absolutist, speak, and that's just kind of what sells. And the same thing, I'll pick on my dad as an example here, because he's a really intelligent guy and he speaks in the most absolute terms. And then as soon as you press him, he goes, "Oh, it's absolute." Like he'll literally use the word absolute all the time, or absolutely. And they say, "Dad, what percentage?" He goes, 65. The fuck didn't you say 65% for? Why are you saying it with such certainty? But I think the reason is because you're cultured. You grab attention by doing it that way. You capture people, and I don't know. My dad and I are Northeastern Jews. We like to argue. So when you say something in an absolutist term, you get, somebody firing back, and you get exactly what you're looking for, a nice argument.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was even thinking about like decision making within probabilities, which I suppose is way more complicated, but I even like it's it's even more common to run into people talking about like Bayesian analysis in everyday conversation. I don't know what broke that through to the
I'm gonna
general
say Michael
population.
Lewis. I'm gonna give him a
Is
lot of
it?
credit. Yeah, like
Yeah.
Liar's Poker, Big Short, stuff like that.
Yeah, that probably is a big part of it. But whoever's doing that is kind of laying the groundwork for better decision making in a probabilistic sense, right? Like that's kind of the, well, I don't know if that's the, I don't remember enough of my studies to know if that's like the fundamental model that defines probabilistic thinking, but it certainly seems like it, right? Having a prior and working off of a prior, like that's kind of probabilistic thinking 101. So
Yeah. I think a lot of the sales pitch also comes from the social sciences. Even like, you've heard of the replication crisis?
I don't think so.
Okay, a lot of the famous social science experiments, like take the marshmallow test for example, have failed to
Oh yeah.
replicate. They've tried to kind of replicate a lot of these things recently and found that no, this bias or that was accounting for it, or it's not really about what we thought it was. But even that aside, because I don't think it got all that much attention mainstream, I think when you hear about this is probably like from a Gladwell book, but a famous symphony or orchestra doing tryouts. Actually, I think they pretty much all do this now, where you can't see the player; they're behind a screen or whatnot, and they make much better decisions. Like just that interviews tend to cause worse hiring practices than not even having an interview in many cases. And those stories, I think, latch on really strongly. Where as soon as you hear Bayesian priors, like it falls pretty quickly sometimes. And when numbers get invoked, it's pretty tricky to sell it mainstream, but stories attach so quickly. But yeah, I don't know. I think it's reached mainstream in a variety of different ways. But I think about like Gladwell and Lewis, but maybe that's my own bias having read them.
Yeah. You talking about the marshmallow test reminded me that I feel like I heard Maria Konnikova recently talking about that, because she either worked under or worked with the guy who like crafted that study originally. And I remember she was fired up. Like I think she was saying that it can be replicated, but it was attempted to be replicated incorrectly or something. Anyway, just for your own interest, you might want to look into that.
What I had heard, the summary I got was that it essentially, rather than being indicative of the idea was that these children who withheld, or waited and got the 2 marshmallows were going to do better in all these different ways in life later on. I can't remember the myriad ways that they would be more successful, but when they looked at it, what it really came down to was socioeconomic status, that basically rich kids could hold off because they were always getting their full meals. They always knew that, hey, good things will come, and if you wait, they're never disappointed. Whereas if you, have gone hungry at all, if you, live in a poor neighborhood where everyone kind of grabs what's in front of them at this moment, it comes from a reason. It appears for a reason, which is that, hey, you might not have this. Leaving that marshmallow on the plate is a fucking, foolish thing to do.
Yeah.
Someone else might take it. And I think that was, and then the idea was, yes, if you grow up rich, you're going to be doing better with these certain traits than if you grow up poor. But that may be wrong.
It's escaping me what the detail was that Maria took issue with. Although I'm pretty sure I just remembered that it was when she was on the GTO Wizard podcast, and now I'm doubting if that podcast was ever even released, because I'm pretty sure they can that whole project. So it's possible that I just heard a conversation that never made it to YouTube. But
I'm curious. She's got.
I'll find it for you after. She started that podcast with Nate Silver. The name's escaping me, but yeah,
Nate's great. Maria seems great, but I've actually never talked to her. In your own game, how do you try to make sense of what is instinct and what is your bias?
Yeah, it's tough. So I guess the short answer is like mental game coaching, because it's like some of it is self-reflection, right? I mean, when you say my own bias, like I can think back to the way that I've played in big spots or in general, just things that I've taken from, let's say, Heads Up and brought to live tournaments. And by being self-reflective, I can know certain things about what I like to do, like the types of things that feel good to me. And that in and of itself might take some work for someone to get to the bottom of, like recognizing what they like to do. So if I'm just kind of generally aware of that, it's a little easier to rule out bias when I get a really strong feeling in game now, because like maybe before I couldn't have trusted it so well, but now that I know a little bit more about myself and I'm a little bit more conscious of the fact that I might prefer to do certain things in certain moments, when a really strong feeling comes up, it's more likely, guided by something new, different. But even instincts just like they feel different, depending on where they're coming from. And I think I spoke, this must have been years ago. I had a conversation on a podcast a while ago that I remember talking about, ignoring my instincts or learning to do the opposite of what my gut was telling me in certain moments.
Mm-hmm.
And that was at a period of time where I was changing game formats. Like that was maybe 1 year detached, if memory serves. 1 year detached from playing heads up full time and pretty fresh into playing live tournaments. And if I get like a strong instinctual feeling in a live tournament when I've only been playing for a year, like that's not worth anything. I mean, that like, what is that?
Yeah.
What experience am I drawing from? Right. Like I'm probably drawing from a completely different experience.
Mm-hmm.
It's not so different from like the fight or flight experience you might get through, the anxiety that you feel when you're, I don't know, playing online poker in the safety of your own office. Like, what are we doing? Right. Like your brain's not finding real information from this real environment. It's grabbing from somewhere else. So I definitely used to experience that and solved it by ignoring my instincts, which was, or even fighting against them, which is maybe not the best method, but at the time it's what I had. But since working with a coach, like I think I just got better connected to what it felt like to have an instinct, or because sometimes an instinct, I would argue that the thing for me that it's easier to confuse with is like a feeling of fear or a feeling of excitement, like rather than a bias.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little less worried about my bias driving me, I guess, just because I've thought about it so much. But I'm more concerned that in the moment I'll be like super anxious, but I haven't checked in on myself in too long. And then I get to a point and like my whole body's telling me to fold, but it's not because I have a really good read that I should fold. It's because I'm terrified, that is really hard to distinguish. So I think through some like work with a coach who's good at that kind of stuff, made a big difference. And really the bottom line was just like being more aware of myself, my surroundings, how I'm feeling, being a little bit more connected with my body when I'm working, when I'm playing cards.
When you mentioned that, a couple things occur to me. The first is going back to something you said early. If it's not something you want to do, if, instead of this being the kind of thing that you like to do, your instinct is telling you to do something that you don't like, it feels like you can trust that a little bit more, in that there's kind of this, incongruency. And that's kind of how I feel about my values typically. If my instinct is telling me I should behave in a way that is not particularly enjoyable for me to behave, I'm like, you should probably trust that, because you're not, naturally, oriented that way. The second part to me was, this is something I feel like I've been coaching players for a while in this manner, and it does not seem to take. I think I need to reframe it, which is, don't dismiss your instincts. You want to put them in there, but you want to layer it on and do it last, because try to table it for a minute. Okay, I think Kevin is bluffing because he's doing that thing that I've seen, people of his archetype do, XYZ, whatever. But you still need to do a GTO analysis. You might have a terrible, terrible bluff catcher that is not quite worthy of that read influencing you enough. And you need to kind of go through the hand start to finish again. But so that's my recommendation to people, is table it for the moment, forget about it, but go back to the beginning and do your full GTO analysis to the degree that you're able to, and then put it in. But I don't think that really happens. I notice even in myself that it's very tough to truly table it. You have any thoughts on that? Any recommendations on how to integrate your read, your instinct with your GTO analysis or your best technical analysis?
Yeah. I mean, I have taught, like, I guess let's call it a decision-making framework. Like I've taught a way to approach, let's say, like big river spots, for example, where, you know, you're facing an all-in, and you have a bluff catcher, and you need to decide if you're calling or folding. This is like, you know, the simplest version of it. And what the instinct thing is kind of hidden in here, but I'll just kind of lay out the analysis first. I normally teach people to review the hand as step number one. So like literally relive the hand, like replay the hand in your head step by step, kind of go through the whole thing. And I find that this, even just the reminder that this is what you need to do in that moment, is very helpful for getting out of any like urgent thoughts and re-experiencing all the facts, like all the data points that occurred throughout the hand. So having that as step one, I think helps at least like turn down the volume on an instinct or on a feeling that's sitting in the front of your mind. And then from there, you know, I'm kind of encouraging people to make exploits first and go to theory if they come up empty. So, you know, to try to make the best call or the best fold or whatever for the situation, if they found in their replaying of the hand that something jumped out at them and they were like, yeah, that makes the decision, like I've got to call. But if they come up empty by going through that process, then I'm kind of the mindset, go through your theoretical knowledge for the spot and just make the best play that you think you can make. So I think that the instinct part would come in at step 2 here. Like, you've replayed the hand, you've relived it, you've decided that the instinct, you know, is coming from this point in the hand. Maybe you've now found the source of it, and now you're convinced, okay, like, let's go with it. Or maybe you replay the hand and you're like, you know, maybe in the replaying you get to the point where you're like, I'm not really sure why I feel like I should call. You know, I've gone through the rational reliving of this spot, and I just can't find the source of this. So like, why do I care so much about this? And I think that should, you know, if we're doing this in a level-headed way, I think that should interject enough logic in the player to realize, like, maybe I should get to theory. Like, maybe I should just, you know, put some caution into this line. So that would be my only like adjustment. I like what you're saying, but my only adjustment, I think, is having like the physical procedure to go through that takes them a little bit out of, you know, the urgency to make a river decision, and brings them back to like, what got us here? Like, why am I feeling this way? What are all the relevant information points? Then I'm not going to say like, you have to use instinct or you have to use theory. That's not really for me to decide on the outside. As the coach, I think just let the player do their thing at that point, as long as they've, you know, stepped back, and maybe it's the equivalent of taking a breath, or, you know, whatever process you might go through. Oh, did I lose you? You're a spinning white circle. I think the last thing he said was shit.
All right. Whew.
Oh, hello.
All is right. Sorry about that. It's been technical difficulties. All right. So we have, I'm sure we have other things in common, but we have 2 major things in common, which are we both coach a lot of poker, and we both love heads up and come from heads up. So actually, we haven't talked about it in a long time, but where would you say your love of heads up is these days? How much passion do you have for heads up poker in general?
Oh, I mean, it's still my favorite format to play. I rarely play it anymore, but I've had a few opportunities like to set up matches online, or I got to go to the lodge and play Doug last year. And whenever the World Series, you know, 25K heads up, formerly 10K heads up, whenever that event runs, or that one in Florida that they did, like, those are so exciting for me. I will clear my schedule for an event like that, because you don't get so many of them. and I think even online they're becoming less and less common. It's just the best. I think it's obviously I didn't get into heads up for exactly these reasons, but in terms of like sport-like competition within poker, the strategizing, like the kind of lack of structure that you're dealing with, just the one versus one environment is, yeah, you can't find it anywhere else in poker, and it's super fun.
Yeah, I actually, I don't know if we've spoken about this before, but I love those heads up tournaments too, and I'll play them. And one of the things I like about them is that when they end, they end. And as painful as that is, I think I have an addiction to heads up poker. I think that I don't have an addictive personality, but I kind of have to keep it out of my life because it's my favorite thing to do when I'm doing it by a long shot, especially if it's going well.
Yeah.
And I can't really be present in other parts of my life if I have someone that I think I'm making decent money playing heads up against them and good competition, especially if they'll like four table me. There's just nothing like it. And I kind of feel like an addict when I'm in a heads up mentality. Can you describe for someone who's never played deep stack heads up, where that's never been, a part of their poker background, what it's like between the mental warfare, kind of controlling your own tilt, everything that goes on playing just fucking queen two offsuit on the button?
Yeah, I mean, we kind of talked a little already about the dynamic that you end up paying attention to in these matches, which is like, what's the last time that they use this bet size? What's the last time that they, showed down a 3-bet pot? What's the last time that they showed down running this exact line? You have this intimate history and intimate memory of exactly playing against this person, even if you've only been playing a few hands.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much more information kind of informing the game, and so much less of that like, this is the rigid strategy that I'm supposed to perform in this spot. I mean, it could be that if you wanted it to be nowadays, but that's not the fun part. But I feel like what I remember the most about playing heads up are little things like how absurd it could be at some times. Like if you're playing a lot of tables against someone and you have serious decisions on all tables simultaneously, the absurd situations that you find yourself in when someone decides to just kind of go off tree, so to speak, and do something
Mm-hmm.
silly because they think that it's just going to work against you. I feel like if we had played together more in our day, I would have run into more of that, because you were definitely someone who took people off tree. But like
Sure.
the I don't know, like the whole atmosphere of it is, like I said, very sport like, because you are either constantly adjusting or being adjusted to, and you need to, I shouldn't say you need to, but at a high level, what you want to have is like a lot of different strategies, a lot of different things that you can do, and it really tests your ability to kind of move with the flow of the game and be flexible in your approach, which I think is just the best part.
Yeah, I think intimate is a really good word because, like in the negative connotation, I would say when things are going well, you're just like head fucking them so hard. And when things are going poorly, of course, the inverse. But then there's the positive connotation, the more common connotation, I think, of intimate, which is kind of this like brotherhood, this just feeling, like when I've had an opponent, even if I really dislike him for whatever reason while it's going on, just knowing that we kind of have so many of the same approaches, there is this intimacy to it, even if you guys don't chat at all. Just kind of knowing, I imagine chess players have this too. Just like you're kind of transposing these thoughts onto their brain that are probably very accurate, and when you get owned by like an off tree value bet, that was just like a few pips too light, and you're like, oh my God, this guy is so deep in my brain right now. He knows I would never have, checked this spot with better, and fuck. And it's just like, Yeah, there's so much going on that I love a good heads up battle. And there does feel like, I've had before where I'm playing on an apps where you can't even chat and it's just some random screen name. You don't even know what country they're really from. And there's this intimacy that develops even without having any communication other than our cards, finding themselves on their back from time to time. That is just like, yeah, I don't know how to describe it to a non heads up player, but it is addicting to me.
Yeah. The other thing is like because you're playing every hand, and because strategy leads you to showdown so often, or like the hands actually reveal information so often. Like you do learn a lot about each other. Kind of speaking to what you mean about an intimate environment. Like you could play. I don't know. I've played live tournaments in Florida for whatever the last 3 years, right? And half the people that we play with, if you ask me like what's a profile you could give me on this person, it's like I don't know. Like I played 2 showdowns with them in the last 3 years. Like I don't know that much about them. I can't really. I can tell you like their name and what they look like. That's about it. But if I play heads up with someone for 1 hour, like I know I could list off 20 things about that person, right? Because you get so much back. So it is kind of like you're seeing the long run really, really quick, or at least you get to play that game that you don't get to play, those iterations that you don't get to play in other formats. I think that's what you're getting at. That I think is maybe that's the addicting part.
Especially if you're playing deep stack multiple tables at once, there's so much adversity. And when you see each other in these times of adversity where no one is playing remotely perfect, I mean, playing early position versus early position, 25 big blinds, chip EV is just not that difficult to do. So there's just not, I mean, you can make mistakes, of course, but, you're not going to make catastrophic errors if you've been playing this game, for a fair amount of time. Whereas heads up, I mean, 300 big blinds deep, and especially if you're playing 3 tables at once, you can do some really, really terrible things, even as a very, very good player, whether they were exploitative and didn't work out, or whether you just lacked the knowledge or the time to kind of go through your process and get to the knowledge that you did have. And I think there's something about working through so much adversity, both players making so many mistakes all the time, that you get into each other's mental game to some degree. You start to kind of say like, hey, this guy is good at balancing timing, or this guy's good at balancing his timing until he starts losing. These different things.
Yeah,
I think like tilt is one of the really interesting parts that I don't think, of the top 100 heads up players today, you'll see all that much tilt, but you'll still see way more tilt in heads up than you do, backing away from heads up for a moment. I think this is a topic that doesn't get talked about too much, is how common tilt was 15 years ago in poker, and what a major part. Like there were people who were winning players simply because they didn't tilt. They were like disciplined nits and they didn't tilt, and that was like enough to win. And these days, outside of like, a whale with a substance problem at a private game, you don't hear all that much about like, oh yeah, when this guy tilts, he's a fucking animal and just like plays absolutely terrible.
Yeah.
Big change.
I think it comes up in kind of subtle ways. And, I was thinking back to like the way I would have approached a heads up game if I felt like someone was getting steamed, or like if I definitely used to feel more connected when I was playing heads up with like my opponent's emotional state, or, have a good sense of what mood they're in. And if you can get, if you're playing a live tournament and you can see someone is, feeling defeated, for example, like, is that person going to be capable of making a big fold right now, is like a thought that might cross my mind. And that's like adjacent to tilt, right? Like they're not steaming, and they're not, open jamming 20 big blinds with 7-3 or whatever, but
a lot of soft tilt. Doesn't want to bluff it off now. Wants to have a clean bust with a flip.
Yeah. Like you're going to run into stuff like that. And I think, again, like all that heads up experience primes us to identify things like that. And a lot of players just wouldn't see it, or they wouldn't, think to take advantage of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it also really helps with button versus big blind and small blind, big blind. Just having played so many crappy hands just gets you a lot more comfortable, even though there's certainly different dynamics. But just knowing what it's like to play with, 2/3 of the deck.
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of those. That was one of those things I didn't realize I was good at until I found out that nobody else was good at it. Like that was one of those like, oh, I didn't realize people were uncomfortable playing 60% in the big blind. Like that's just what I'm out here. I'm like, do I really need to fold 7-3 off? Like, I'd love to see a flop with this.
Yeah, I'm with you. All right, some questions about Heads Up. Because you were a Heads Up cash player for a long time, you moved to tournaments. When did you move to tournaments? How long ago?
I guess I would say like early 2019.
Okay, so surely you've done a lot of work on Heads Up with Big Blind Ante.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. What would you say? I don't want the humble answer either. I want the real answer. Your ROI, 80 big blinds in play, starting even stacked, 40 big blinds apiece, against a randomly chosen top 200 tournament player in the world. What would you put your ROI at? We're going to say 30-minute levels. You're playing live.
So, I mean, I'll go through the rough calculation, I guess, because
Yeah.
I'm obligated to. I guess that structure is not so far from like an online deep stack sit and go kind of structure. Like 40 big blinds live, 30-minute levels feels like sort of like that's a pretty good structure. So there's a fair bit of play, and I would say that, especially in big blind ante, I would say that the edges that I can get against a typical tournament player are pretty big in the reg versus reg realm. Like I don't think I can win 65% of the time, but I could probably win 57% of the time.
That's really big. That's a 14 ROI, right?
So that would be 14% ROI. Yeah. Like that might be pushing the limits of the structure a little bit. Like they're not going to make horrible mistakes, but I've done enough study on big blind ante pre-flop to know that like making a one big blind mistake in an individual pre-flop spot is probably more common than a lot of those tournament pros would like to acknowledge. Like I think they're making one big blind mistakes in somewhat common spots, like not crazy common, but somewhat common. So I think I could get there.
Okay, let's say you are coaching 10 hours with a break-even Triton player against a top 20 Triton player. You're just coaching them for that heads up experience. What do you think you could get them to with 10 hours of coaching?
I mean, they could go pretty far. I mean, I'm hoping they can go pretty far. So I am working on a course for this, and because I've taught like kind of a quick version of tournament heads up strategy to a few different private students, to a few different like tournament stables online before. And I decided like, why not just package this into a course? The eventual course is only going to be like 3 hours probably. I mean, maybe it's going to be like 5 hours of content. But I think the main points that I'd like to teach someone in that time frame can be taught in like 3 hours. And then we could probably spend a few hours working on that specific opponent and what they might be bad at, or like, doing a little bit of research into that opponent.
Sure.
And I was saying I would be 57% like without even knowing the leaks of the specific leaks of my opponent, right? So I might get them close to the same number. I mean, maybe they'd be 54% to win or something like that. I have a habit of overestimating the instincts of someone who's never played heads up before. I probably shouldn't make that mistake again. But a lot of the I shouldn't also. I wish we could like name specific people to some extent, because a lot of the Triton players have played heads up at some point in their career. Like there's a good chunk of top tournament players who were at some point sit and go players, or at some point heads up no limit players. And when you mix them in, like, I mean, we're not getting 54% against Ike. Like Ike used to be the best heads up no limit player in the world.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think I can tell you that as a heads up player and someone who probably more than anything else in poker have taken pride in my heads up game over the years, I got heads up at a PCA 25K in maybe 2017 or something, and big blind ante was very new. And I did not remotely adjust enough for big blind ante, had never looked at anything big blind ante, and I played terrible consequently. Like I just like, oh, I'm a heads up player, I'll do fine. And I just was I was very poorly calibrated. Ended up paying the price too and losing. But yeah, that was an interesting lesson for me, which is heads up is not just about being a good poker player. It's adjusting to your individual format. Whether it's 60 big blinds, no ante, or 250 big blinds, no ante, or 30 big blinds, big blind ante is just an entirely different game.
Yeah. I mean, for anyone playing in the Tritons or like in the big live tournaments, I would imagine they've put a chunk of hours already into using, like, there's a number of tools now that can produce a very, very good heads up strategy very quickly. And I imagine they've put a few hours into that. But there's always that extra, like if you or I did that same amount of study, we can kind of layer in that heads up knowledge that we have and make assumptions about what our opponents might have a hard time with, what they might get wrong, like that. But that little bit of prep is really all they need.
Yeah. Tough question for you. Not necessarily heads up, but trying to predict the poker meta, what do you think strategically are going to be some of the biggest differences between where the game is at today and let's flash forward 2 years from now, and you could take we'll keep it to tournaments, but you could say mid stakes live tournaments, high stakes online tournaments, anything. But curious where you not necessarily are confident, but have a guess about where the poker meta might be changing.
So the place my brain went was like thinking about my knowledge of what the advancements in tooling is likely to look like over the next 2 years, because I think that's at least at high stakes, that's going to determine what people are studying, and what they study is going to determine how they play, right? So and that stuff tends to trickle down. So I mean, I within 2 years, like I would expect to have full multi-way preflop solvers, being much faster, being much more accessible. I don't know what they're going to produce. Like, I don't know how they're going to tell us to play, but however they're playing is going to be the meta. Like that's just gonna enter our gameplay, right? I mean, there might be some discerning reasons to do something different, but I would expect like more consolidation around commonly agreed upon like preflop strategies, because the tools are just going to get better in that area, and then they're going to disseminate that information through the games. So that's probably a major change. And similarly, like, I mean, multi-way post-flop strategies and bet sizing, you still see a good variation of how different players approach this stuff. And again, as tools get more accurate and more accepted in those areas, then I would expect strategies to start to get adopted. So that's kind of a broad thing of what I would expect to happen, but I don't know specifically what they'll be doing. And keep in mind, that's also all going to be able to be informed with ICM strategy, right? So like maybe there's just some stuff that we don't know what we don't know. So like there's some key decision points in tournaments that might just start looking very different, maybe at the highest level. I don't know that would spread through the whole poker world in 2 years, but at the highest level, you might see some very different strategies on bubbles or some very different strategies at final tables than we're seeing today, but it's hard for me to say exactly what.
Yeah, when you mentioned the multi-way pots, something that comes to mind for me, hadn't thought about this, but I'll bet you on something like 10% of textures, we're going to see some 3 and 4-way pots where you'll see some more like B80 to B125, where people are right now just kind of following the just multi-way pot meta in general and saying a lot of check, B33, don't really bet big in 3 or 4-way pots on the flop.
Yeah, and that's like in my mind, that's a totally reasonable simplification that we're using right now. But once the tool can just tell us like the right situations to use the bigger size, then overnight it's just part of your strategy, right? So yeah. I wouldn't be surprised by that either.
Do you like to be an early adopter or wait until you see it kind of proven for a while in general when you're talking about kind of wacky things that you might see from a solver?
I kind of have I mean, I've gone through different moods, I guess, when it comes to this. I definitely over my career have been someone who likes to strategize before I implement. So I like to kind of have a good handle on why I'm doing something and what it's accomplishing for me before I start putting it out there. But then every now and then I kind of go backwards on that lately because I feel equipped to wing it better than my opponents in like certain areas. So in certain areas, I'm a little happier to just kind of throw strategy structure aside and say like, yeah, I'm just gonna do this because I think this is better. But
You're speaking to the right guy, Captain Chaos.
yeah, I mean, I know this about you. We haven't played that many hands in the last few years, but there's always a few interesting ones, and like,
yeah,
and I love that stuff. It's not something that I do in areas where I feel like my opponents are better prepared, right? Like I'm not gonna.
Yeah.
There's certain leading spots that I just don't take right now because I think that they're not helpful to me. Like I'm not convinced the response is difficult, and I'm not convinced that my opponents are less studied than me. So I'm just like, I'm just not going to worry about that. Like that's kind of the way I would approach these type of decisions. And there's certain bet sizes that I'm like, yeah, like it's marginally useful, but I'm not sold on it. And other people are doing it way too much. So like I'm just not using it.
Yeah.
I've definitely found myself doing some of that lately, but in other spots where I'm more comfortable just doing whatever I feel like will work.
All right, you know the deuce through ace game, the one that some people call wavelength. I call the game because it's got so much importance. Down for a round?
Sounds good.
Excellent. All right, you randomize a card on your phone. Tell me when you got it, and I'll look away.
I have got one.
Good?
Yep, you're good.
All right. Question number one. We're going to go with the heads up theme. Your heads up in the main event. And this is the player. We're going to say people who play 10K plus on occasion. Doesn't mean they have to be a professional, but from that player pool, ace is who you think would be the softest opponent. I'm going to assume heads up for the main event. You're not really interested in fun factor, that this is going to be purely who you have the best chance of winning against. And we're going to say you get heads up 60 BB deep against this player. 2 is who you would least like to face. Take your time.
I'm going to give this to Sean Winter.
Playing Sean Winter heads up. Okay. Excellent. You trained as a chef and got very good at cooking. I don't know if cooking is not the right term. There might be a better, more
cooking.
Advanced. Okay. This is what you did instead of that. In an alternate life, Kevin Rabichow devoted that time and energy to getting very good at this, to being pretty not that happy with what you chose. Ace being great decision.
I'll borrow an answer from another part of my life. I'll have spent that time learning to train dogs.
You have a dog. You like dogs. This didn't jive as much with my Sean Winter answer. Winter has some heads up experience for sure. He's a good player. So we're talking Sean is definitely 6 or lower. We took the entertainment factor out, so there's no boost there. Training dogs sounds pretty boring, but I mean, it's a cool thing. Fuck. 4.
Nailed it.
Let's go.
I maybe I made it sound a little too appealing, training dogs, but like I think from what I've seen, it's like kind of a pretty miserable experience. Like it's
That's fair.
From my experience in training my own dog, it is not fun, and it's just like so much effort and so little positive feedback. I mean, it's not the worst thing ever, but it doesn't seem very enjoyable to me.
That's fair. I can see that. Yeah. I was overrating just having anything to do with dogs, but makes sense. We got there. Felt good.
Nice
the Sean
work.
Winter answer was grounding. That was like 3 to 5 has to be. It's tough to imagine he's the 2, and for him to be higher than a 5 seems preposterous. But yeah.
He stuck out in my head because he bubbled me in the last time I played the 25K WSOP.
So we have a hand of yours here that I'm pretty familiar with because I was the commentator during this. We were in Jeju. You are final 20 of the main events, and we've got a K-Rab open from the cutoff. Mario flats the button. Andrew Pantling here in the big blind is going to overcall Queen 9 off, and right away, there's some ICM going on here with 20 left. Is this the bottom of your open from the cutoff here? Or do you think it was Jack 9-0? What do you think you would have been opening there?
I think I forget who the small blind was in this hand, but I think I would have been pretty conservative opening. Like, even though I do have good chips, Andrew was playing wild. And he has even stack or whatever. So this is not a big blind I'm going after light for sure.
Makes sense. So you guys go 3-way to the flop. And let's talk about your approach here on Ace King 2 as Andrew checks and then says, "Do I have the Queen of Spades?" Yeah, I do.
That's a funny one in hindsight. I wasn't really paying much attention to Andrew in this hand. I mean, once we get past the flop. But I thought about this spot as maybe like if I was playing it from an earlier position open, I think I would just be attacking an Ace King X board with like a lot of C betting. I felt in this spot opening from the cutoff, I had too weak of a range to take that approach. And Mario's flat is pretty strong. Like it, I don't know exactly how high up he flats with like Ace Jack, Ace Queen type hands, but he's pretty strong with his flatting range. So I thought chance
with Andrew behind, maybe he's even trapping the occasional monster that just wouldn't find its way into a normal sim flatting here.
Yeah, it's a good point. Like he's only 30 big blinds effective with me, so he might flat kings to get the squeeze out of Andrew or something. So like, I decided, or I remember thinking in game that I would rather approach this in a more polar fashion because I felt like my range wasn't strong enough to just bet everything for small. I thought Mario would play really well against that. So I would probably have just bet like whatever my big size is in this spot, like half pot or something with some percentage of bluffs and some pretty good hands and check everything else.
So you do opt to check, and Mario checks his pocket eights behind. 10 rolls off. Andrew throws down another check. Let's talk about your spot here.
Yeah. So at this point, I do remember thinking, I'm pretty sure Andrew's like already folded. Like it is, and it just is the way he was acting. I don't know if that's clear to Mario. From where he's sitting, it's actually a little harder to see Andrew. I don't know how much he's giving stock to that. But at this point, I kind of felt like I was playing a heads up pot against Mario. So my hand's just pretty medium strength. Like there's no reason to bet for value. There's no reason to bluff. I think I just have a clear check, pure check.
Got it. Mario's eights on the button. What are you thinking if we're to play his spot here?
So, I mean, he probably had a decision on the flop as well as to whether to just start bluffing, semi-bluffing, whatever you want to call it. So presumably again here on the turn, he's just thinking about how often, if not always, he's going to start bluffing with this hand category. Like the main thing to note here is there's 3 Broadway cards on the board and he's flatted the button in a high ICM spot. It's unlikely he has total trash to bluff with. It's unlikely he has a whole lot of 9-7 suited, 6-5 suited type hands that he might be flatting at earlier stages of the tournament. So yeah, I mean, this is just the typical hand class to think about bluffing in a tight range spot. He might even bluff here if he has a hand like mine. I'm not so sure about that one, but it's probably going to cross his mind to bluff hands like this. But I don't know if it's pure. Like it's hard to know his exact preflop range, so it's hard to know how many candidates he's going to have like this. But he definitely has the nuts. Like he definitely has Queen Jack suited. He definitely has Ace 10, maybe offsuit. He definitely has King 10 suited. So he can have some really good. He can have pocket tens maybe. So he has some pretty good hands here.
Would you want to play more polar, more linear, split range? What do you think about his spot? Like, I'm wondering, do you ever sneak in a bet with King Queen to check river?
I think it's a valid strategy to throw out. Like this is kind of the spot. If I'm in his position, this is the spot where I'm a little bit inclined, I guess, to react to my situation and improvise what I think is the best strategy to be using given that information. Like I think it's a little silly to pretend that we can just find like the number one best strategy and say like this is what I would always use every time. It's not really how the game. Like I said, I just noticed in the middle of the hand that Andrew's probably check folding. So like I'm just not playing the same spot that's written on screen here when I'm in game. And hopefully he's approaching it the same way to some degree. Maybe he noticed something about me. Like maybe I didn't really think about checking, or maybe I didn't really think about betting the turn. So like if he knows that I'm not really thinking about it, maybe he can go with a more linear strategy. Because I don't have as many like check raises, like as many strong hands. So I think it'd be reasonable to take kind of a linear approach. I think it'd be reasonable to take kind of a polar approach. My feeling of like the theory in this spot is that he probably is not under as much like he's not under as much pressure as the other two of us in this hand. So Andrew and I need to kind of tiptoe around this pot, and knowing that we need to be more cautious allows him to be a little bit more aggressive, at least until one of us folds. So he can probably go with the more linear, like small size approach for that reason and get away with it. Structurally, like get away with it. I don't mean as an exploit, but like in theory, I think he could just get away with it and not face much counter aggression unless it goes Andrew folds and now it's back to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think when I see this spot, take it away from Triton and the three of you and into like the mid stakes, like a $1,600 tournament in Vegas, I tend to think the guy who's really experienced here has kind of carte blanche to do whatever he wants. If he thinks King Queen is worth betting, I kind of trust him to do it. And the person who's a little bit newer to poker and, doesn't have as many table instincts, might not be noticing, what you saw there with Andrew, for example. Then I tell them just wherever you think it's reasonable, kind of lean towards polarizing. You're just less readable and your decision tree is going to be simpler. Your ability to blunder is lower.
Yeah. I think that's reasonable. And I think that's just kind of good. Like multi-way in general, everyone is going to lean a little bit passive and everyone's going to be a little bit cautious. So going for thin value is usually not something I would recommend to the average player. Like it just doesn't line up with the way people play. But it also means you're not going to get punished that much. Like you're probably not going to. What's the worst that could happen if you bet 25% pot here with King Queen? Really, like, are you going to face crazy check raise aggression? I mean, I might check raise my hand. So like in this real hand, that might be a problem for him. But in general, in a mid stakes tournament, like nothing's really going to go wrong there.
Yep. And that's when you face that check raise that, you could have put in versus B25, for example, that's when you want to have instincts of being at the table and being like, well, my hand lines up like this, but also the dynamic with Kevin, I think he's just always betting his great hands maybe on the situation. So sure, I wasn't betting to induce, but now that I'm here, calling off or saying, hey, this guy would never check raise bluff me. I'll ditch the King Queen.
Yeah.
So Mario does go for it. I believe he bets about half pot.
Yeah, and when he bets this big, like I know his game well enough to know that this is his polarized approach, right? Like this doesn't include King Queen, which is going to influence the way that I think about, whether or not I should be check raising or check calling or check folding, I guess.
Was there any thought of check fold? I get that it's kind of clarified to not raising, but was this a clear call, or did you think about it?
I definitely thought about it, but I don't think I should fold this type of hand. Like, I think there's merit in folding jacks or queens. I think I would fold a hand like King 7 suited pretty confidently. Like, those types of bluff catchers are going to perform a lot worse than this one. I mean, I say I would fold them. Like, I think those would fold first, I guess is what I really mean. I don't know that I would fold those hands for sure, but they're lower in the hierarchy.
I might put like an ace 4 of hearts on the muck here.
Yeah, I mean, it's not crazy. Like, I think, I don't know if this is just Mario's default way of playing or if he also noticed that Andrew didn't seem interested in the pot. But like, if you were at this table, you would know it was pretty scary to put in action against Andrew. Like, he was all over the, like,
I was commentating it. It was great TV.
He's a smart player, and you might remember him from the old Heads Up Sit and Go days. But like, the way he played in modern terms was pretty reckless and like pretty aggressive and just very loose. So putting in a bluff multi-way with him involved in the hand is like no, I don't know, it's no walk in the park.
Yeah, makes sense. So you do go for call. Mario adjusts the bluffing scarf. We've got pretty much a brick. I mean, the pocket fours bluff gets there, but at that point, there's kind of no bricks left in the deck. I think at the time I was saying maybe a 9 is the closest thing to a brick. I think pocket 9 is a little too high up to bluff.
He might not even call the button with fours at this depth. Like, he might just be in the muck with fours. I thought about that in hindsight with this hand, because like him bluffing with eights and with the 8 of spades struck me as a little bit of an overbluff, and I wasn't sure if he was doing that like as part of a plan, or if he was doing it just because he felt that the bottom of his calling range pre was like 6s or 7s or something, and then like if he sets that as the bottom and then he decides 6s would bluff the flop, and like he only arrives here with so many candidates, then he just decides, I got to bluff with the spades sometimes, like that.
Yeah, I think he was just over bluffing. That would be my guess. I think it's probably your guess as well, but yeah, blocking the 10-8 of spades, blocking the king 8 of spades. I think he just wanted to go for it.
Yeah, I maybe should have just asked him. I don't know. I never asked.
Yeah. I think, everyone has tough to say about Mario today, but I think at that stage, Mario was really going for it, and maybe having not had history with you or much to that point. That was my thought when I was watching this hand. I was like, this feels like a really dicey bluff on the turn, and then on the river it feels like, okay, I can't win, so I'll bluff. But yeah, at the same time, he did run into a really tough spot for you. So we'll see what Mario does. $900. What percent is that?
Like 70% or so.
Yeah.
And it's half of his stack.
Take us through your spot. What's going on in the process?
So this, I guess, like what I'd like to be doing here and what I did here are a little different. Because I remember at this stage of the tournament, I had run out of time banks. We were pretty close. I mean, not super close to the end of the day. I guess you can see there's like an hour and a half left on the stream. So I was maybe, I don't know how far from the end of the day, but I think I was out of time banks for the last 40 minutes before this. So I had to play like a good chunk of the day without time banks. This was the one hand where I really was affected by that, because I kind of think that I thought through the hand to the point where I identified all the value that Mario could have, like relatively easily. I was pretty certain of all the hands I already mentioned, like Queen Jack suited, King 10 suited, maybe Ace 10 offsuit, maybe pocket 10s. Like those all came to mind, and those all seemed very realistic for him. he also like did something. I don't know if it's on the he did something physical before he bet that like really captured my attention in the moment. And I don't know if it's on the recording, but if you look, like he's kind of leaned back in his chair because he's in the 8 seat. So he had to lean forward to take notice of the shot clock. And it was like this very deliberate, like this big lean forward. I think it's noticeable, but I remember it capturing my attention, and I remember taking a fair bit of time to try to process what that meant. And by the time I was done doing that, I was already so low on time that I like kind of had to rush through my actual decision. So that was like, that's like my big regret in hindsight, was that I allowed that to capture my attention for so long in a shot clock tournament where I had no time banks. And like, I needed to power through, you know, I needed to move past that and get to the point where I just decide if it's a good bluff catch or not. So like in hindsight, I think I have a really good bluff catcher. Like I remove all the stuff I've been talking about, and I don't remove any bluffs. I don't think I remove any bluffs. I don't think he has Jack 9 suited probably at this stage. So I think he just has all the low pocket pairs, basically, like maybe like a 9-8 suited kind of hand. Nothing I interfere with, most likely. And if he was bluffing Jack 10 on the turn, I don't think he bluffs the blank river with it. I think that would only end up being a bluff on like the 7 of spades or something, maybe. So I'm just like, yeah, I was pretty disappointed in hindsight that I didn't get to the point where I was like, oh, this is a pretty good bluff catcher. Like, just call this guy, because I know he's aggressive. Sure. I know it's a good bluff catch. It doesn't even hurt my stack that much to call if I'm wrong. So I think it was like a very good call to take. But the distraction in the moment did not allow me to do it.
So the question about the aftermath, you make this fold, you see it on stream or hear about it, and then of course there's sadness about the result, but there's also, it sounds like, some disappointment about what your process looked like. How do you move forward in a constructive manner after being disappointed in yourself, but now having to play still one of the biggest spots of your tournament career?
Yeah. In some way, I guess it was lucky that was close to the end of the day, because, you know, I had some time to just like step away and cool off. I didn't have to like play until 4 a.m. and finish out the tournament or whatever. I mean, and, you know, I don't end up winning or anything, but like the in-game process that I've found helpful to me is not too different from what I suggested earlier about like having a go-to process to think through to get yourself out of that like instinctive emotional state, you know, reviewing the hand, for example. Whenever I have a significant change to my stack, I make a habit of reorienting myself, like my stack size, with the rest of the table stack sizes. So I kind of have this habit of, you know, okay, now I'm playing whatever it was, 2.8 million or whatnot. That's 35 big blinds. And then I go around the table and I'm going to check Mario stack. Okay, now I have 35 big blinds on my left, like kind of just reorienting the situation that I'm playing from the technical point of view. It's a good little hack, I guess, to reframe what I'm doing next, but it also puts me in the mindset of like, you've got a task to accomplish right now, not like, you know, woe is me kind of thoughts. That doesn't mean it's not going to still like sit with me, but I think that helps for the short term, just to like be able to play the next hand and be able to play the next hand well. But beyond that, like, you have to accept what happened, and I guess I know what not to do, which is maybe what I would have done when I was younger. I know not to like ignore the stream and like pretend it didn't happen and shove it aside and you know, just be rational or whatever, right? Like, no, it's like, that sucked. Like I hated that spot. It was really frustrating. And it was especially frustrating to know that he had like, it was especially frustrating to know he had a bluff in a spot where I felt like, even before I knew that, I made the wrong fold, right? Like if there was any other combination of things, if it was like, I'm not sure if I made the wrong fold and then I see the bluff, like that wouldn't hurt that much. Or if I felt like, oh, really feel like I make the wrong fold and then he just has queen jack, like that wouldn't have hurt either, right? But it's that overlap of like, I really messed that hand up, and then immediately it gets reinforced. Like, yeah, you did. Like the screen just kind of shouts at you. Like, yeah, you did. It's max pain.
Yeah.
But like, yeah, I mean, I acknowledge it for what it is. It's just like, yeah, that was terrible, and I, do my best to make some space for that, and then just show up the next day and count my new stack and count their stacks and play the next hand.
Yeah, that's what it is to be a professional. So on that note, take us through 3 recommendations. My final question, any recommendations of any kind?
Yeah, when you warned me about this, I was like, I don't read that much and I don't watch that much television. And then I started thinking like, well, I do. There was a period of time where I was, only consuming content if I felt like it was helpful to my professional career in some way. So but like, I don't like doing that. I still do that to some extent. I still read books about coaching, for example. I'll give one shout out to a book called Every Moment Matters. I read that book not long ago. I'm forgetting the author's name now, but Every Moment Matters. It's a book about coaching. And I really enjoyed the perspective that it brought. I thought it aligned with a lot of the stuff that we spoke about on the topic of coaching, and understanding people and understanding what motivates them and all the different ways that applies to sport. So that was a really enjoyable read that helped inform some of the things that I want to do in coaching going forward. It's not like exactly a lesser known show, I don't think, but Breakpoint on Netflix was so much fun for me. Did you watch Breakpoint?
No, I haven't heard of it. I'll look it up.
Oh, I'm surprised. So, I mean, it's a tennis documentary, but
okay, I've heard of it. Yeah, no, I didn't see it. It's good.
Yeah, I loved it. I haven't gotten that like engaged with too many shows, but like I used to play a bit of tennis. I actually injured myself the other day playing tennis. So that's like I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with tennis right now. But it's a sport that I used to follow more closely, so I knew like some of the characters, some of the players that were being interviewed, being followed by the show. But it gives you all these great like not back office, but like behind the scenes, scenes of watching coaches interact with the player before a match, watching coaches interact with the player after the match, during just things like that. And I was like, oh, I could watch, like, just give me this. Like, I want to see footage. Like, if I could watch hours of footage of the top coaches in tennis interacting with their athletes, I would just watch like a live stream of that all day. So that all of those scenes were my favorite part. Breakpoint's
I'm gonna check that
out. What else have I got? And like I just watch a lot of cooking shows on YouTube. Like I watch there's a guy who's not quite as big as the biggest shows that I watch. I watch like Binging with Babish and what's his name? Joshua Wiseman. But there's a guy who's a little more like deep dives in system and practical cooking. His name's Ethan Chlebowski. I'm a big fan of his videos. He makes some great like 20-ish minute recipe videos, mostly unedited, mostly very practical for home cooking. It meshes well with my life and what I'm looking for with cooking. So yeah, I just think there's great food content.
On that topic, yeah, then I'm going to make 2 recommendations. One, if you're interested in cooking, follow Kevin on Instagram. He's got beautiful plates. How often do you post food that you make?
You might have to go back like a year and a half to see the food content, because it's been a little while.
Food content's gone. It's done.
I just haven't been updating that much on my Instagram. Okay. Like I during COVID, I was cooking a lot and like cooking ambitiously. So I had a post, I don't know, 2 or 3 times a week, probably in like 2020 and 2021. I'm quite proud of those. But then after that, like once I started traveling again, playing more poker again, and then doing advertising for like my coaching content and various things, other stuff has mixed in on there. But there's still
less
some food
cooking
content
in the Wynn hotel room.
Yeah, you don't see a lot of I think I had like one post from a World Series where I actually made like 3 meals or something. I do okay cooking on the road, but it's hard.
Yeah, for sure.
But all the good stuff is back in like 2022, 2021, if anyone follows me on there.
All right. I'm going to go back on it. I don't have an Instagram, but every once in a while, I'll go on my girlfriend's account and look at a couple things that are suggested. So my other recommendation for anyone who missed our heads up discussion is, I don't know. Heads up players have huge egos, so I don't respect many people's heads up game. But Kevin, whenever he comes out with what he's coming out for MTTs, follow it. Especially if you're distilling it into 3 to 5 hours. I think that sounds very digestible for a lot of people. So I can recommend it without having seen anything. That's the kind of faith I have in Kevin's heads up game.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.